The following content contains material that may be triggering to some audiences.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hope Discovered podcast by CommQuest. My name is Bill, and I will be your host. If you have never heard our program before, what we try to do here is cover issues related to mental health. A lot of times it can also mean AOD, which is alcohol and other drugs recovery. And we always try to give people a message of hope that recovery is possible. And that's what we want to do with our topic today. Our topic today can be considered kind of a tough topic by a lot of folks. We are talking about suicide prevention awareness. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do this discussion is that suicide is often treated a lot of times as a taboo subject. People are afraid to talk about it. And I have noticed, my personal observation is that a lot of times there can be this bizarre romanticization of it, like in the case of a tragic love story or something like that. And those things are all fiction. Okay, suicide in and of and by itself is no different than any other serious mental health phenomenon or condition, I may say, and we should treat it as such. We should talk about it very frankly, and we're going to try to have a very clinical discussion about it today. We have two guests. Our first one is Kylee Crislip with our organization. How are you, Kylee?
I'm well, thank you.
And also Dr. Greg Emanuelson. How are you, Doctor?
I am the same as well. Thank you.
Awesome. It's great to have you both. Let me start with you, Greg. Can you talk about your position and what you do?
I am the clinical site coordinator for our Massillon outpatient site. And at that site, we provide both mental health and addiction services for the general outpatient population.
Very good. Kylee, I'll ask the same of you.
I'm actually the clinical site coordinator at our Cleveland Avenue outpatient location. And I'm going to use Greg's answer as well, because we serve both the populations at our outpatient location too.
That's fantastic. Greg, are you from this area?
Yeah, I was born and raised here in Canton. I now live in North Canton, but for a brief time when I was down at Ohio State, I lived in Columbus.
Awesome.
And actually, while I was down there, my first clinical experience was working the suicide prevention hotline in Columbus.
So this is hardly a new topic for you.
This is pretty much how I started in behavioral health.
Kylee, I don't believe I know that much about you in terms of where you're from. Are you from this area?
I am. I was born and raised in Stark County, and I do currently live here also. And like Greg, I too lived a period of time in Columbus during my undergrad degree.
What drew you to this field?
Honestly, I just love helping people. I've loved helping people my whole life, and I was lucky to be able to go to grad school for clinical counseling, and I was actually the graduate softball assistant coach too, which allowed me this opportunity. So I'm super grateful, but yeah, just the fact that I love helping people.
Greg, what drew you to this?
I've always been the person that people would come to talk to.
Uh-huh.
And I'm a natural listener.
Sure.
I tend to be a little bit on the quiet side, so people are drawn to that. And so it's just naturally an extension for me to go into behavioral health. You know, it's a listening profession.
Yes, it is. That's a good way to put it. It most certainly is. Getting to our subject of suicide, as I mentioned, it's often regarded in some odd ways. Kylee, what are some of the biggest misconceptions about suicide?
I would say, honestly, the biggest misconception is that if you talk about it, you put the idea of suicide in someone's head, when in reality, the studies show that directly talking about suicide and acknowledging suicide and that people have thoughts can decrease suicidal thoughts, because people are more comfortable opening up about it and getting help and knowing that there's help out there.
Right. Greg, has that been kind of your experience as well?
Very much so. Oftentimes people are afraid to use the S word.
Yeah.
That they're going to plant the idea. The idea is already there. It's actually very comforting that someone is actually being heard by actually saying, are you thinking of suicide? As opposed to, are you thinking about not being here, or being more vague about it? Yeah. By being that direct, the person who's considering suicide actually gets some comfort that finally somebody's listening to me.
Yeah. I would say on a practical terms, I'm not a professional like you two, but I would say on a practical level, certainly the odds of saying nothing are much worse in terms of the outcome. And if you have any fears or qualms about saying something, you have to balance that out in your mind that it's probably, much greater risk to say nothing and act like you ignored it or something like that. Yeah. What are some of the red flags, Greg? A lot of times I hear some of the standard answers. Well, so-and-so started giving stuff away. And are there anything in terms of behavior that should, let's say a parent is noticing in a child, are there little key factors of family members behaving a certain way that we should be hypervigilant in noticing?
Certainly, there's a number of risk factors involved, and you talked about behaviors. Obviously, one is giving away prized possessions, talking about suicide, talking about death, researching things about death, doing online searches. So when you talk about kids and adolescents, if a parent is monitoring what they are doing online and seeing those type of things being researched, that's a definite red flag. Sometimes this preoccupation with death and dying, looking for themes in what they're writing, what they're reading, what they're doing can be an indicator of something that's going on. Sometimes, erratic behaviors, either being overly anxious or overly depressed, changes in their eating or sleeping patterns can be an indication. Withdrawing or isolating themselves can be a big sign of a lot of different things, but of course about suicide, or taking big risks that could lead to death.
Yeah. Interestingly, you talked about things happening online. I would guess that a good part of that is, let's say, when a pop star dies by suicide, and all of a sudden your child develops a fascination with that person and that story.
Very much so. Especially with the younger population, there's this contagion effect. Yeah. That my friend did it, it must be okay, therefore I can do it. Or, a famous person that they idolize.
Yes.
Dies by suicide. Well, if they can do it, so can I. I look up to them. I role model after them.
Mm-hmm. Kylee, do you have any input on that subject?
I would absolutely agree with what Greg said. I mean, he hit pretty much all the big risk factors and warning signs that we talk about frequently. And definitely, I'm going to throw in there, and you might have said this, Greg, or not, but increasing the use of alcohol and drugs too. And I want to throw that in there too, because as an agency here, we're here to provide that hope and provide that help to people who feel like they can't do it on their own. So that also is a warning sign here. And with the contagion and with the young population, talking about it, educating parents, educating friends, decreasing that stigma so that it doesn't fall into that contagion effect that we've experienced in this county.
Yes. You touched upon this already, both of you have, in terms of saying something when something comes up that is a little alarming. With that being said, Kylee, I'll start with you. It can be an awkward subject to broach. A lot of people might have the idea, well, what am I going to say to somebody? Are you planning on killing yourself? How should that subject be broached?
And I agree. It's definitely a scary thing to talk about and thinking about saying something to someone. But being direct, like we said previously, is really important. Saying things like, you don't seem yourself, is everything okay? And as that opens the door for conversation, just asking, are you thinking about suicide? Do you have thoughts of suicide? Do you have thoughts about harming yourself? Is so important because it allows someone, like Greg was saying earlier, to feel comfortable enough to open up that you care.
Sure. And that's kind of the key statement. I care about you. I'm concerned about you. I'm noticing this. It's making me wonder if, and you can hedge it a little bit. That way it takes a little bit of the sting off of actually saying, are you thinking about suicide as a result of A, B, and C?
That's my, when I discuss this with people, they say, how am I supposed to say that? And those are some great examples because it's very stark just to walk up to somebody and ask them about their tendencies towards suicide.
Yeah, you're not going to go up and say, hi, Bill. So are you thinking about suicide today? I mean, it's out of context.
Yes.
But hopefully within the relationship that you have with that individual, you can broach that subject because you are coming from a place of care and concern.
Yes.
I think it's as simple as be direct, but be empathetic. If you can remember that, then you're golden to have those conversations with people you're concerned about.
Absolutely. Greg, when I was managing another interview, you talked about this 10-minute window, which I was blown away by that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Certainly. Back in 2009, there was a major study that looked at the time period between when someone actually starts thinking about suicide and then starts engaging in the behavior of whatever path that they're going to take towards dying by suicide. They call that acute suicidal crisis. And they looked at the time frames, and what they tended to find is that it's less than 10 minutes from the time of onset to the time of action. Wow. So that acute suicidal crisis time period is your time to truly intervene as quickly as possible.
Yes.
Time is of the essence.
Yes. On that subject, Kylee, getting back to broaching the subject, that's why it's so critical to say something. Would you agree about that?
Oh, absolutely. And just in general, talking about it is what's going to help decrease that stigma. Providing education, letting people know these facts that Greg was just discussing is all part of decreasing the stigma around talking about suicide and suicidal thoughts.
Absolutely.
That's part of the reason why having, 24/7 suicide hotlines are so crucial, because if somebody's calling in within that 10-minute time frame, having that compassionate ear to listen can be very helpful.
Yes. This is a good time to say we're going to have some resources at the end of this podcast, but after that mention, I probably should interject here that the National Suicide Prevention number is 800-273-8255. And 8255 spells out the word talk on your keypad. So once again, that number is 800-273-TALK. Getting into stigma, and I'll let you two kind of volunteer in terms of who wants to go first about this. This is something that I don't hear it addressed very often in a lot of the stuff that I've found online. I often hear in the wake of a suicide, someone will say, well, they took the easy way out, or it was a selfish act. I have to stay here and deal with my problems. Their problems are over. And those are horrible things to hear. But here again, we're here to talk about this honestly. And I hear that I'm almost going to say, in the wake of every suicide that's ever happened, at least one person has said it that I've been, associated with in those circles of social circles. Let's talk. I'll let you two volunteer in terms of which one you want to go first. Why is that stigma so, not only is it very mean-spirited and very heartless, but why is it so incorrect?
When you just asked that, it made me think, truthfully, I think it can be easy for some people to say things of that nature because it is a scary subject. And people who haven't had thoughts themselves, it can be difficult for them to understand what someone is truly going through. And that's why we just encourage people to educate themselves, talk about this, and truly just be kind to each other, because you never know what someone else is going through.
Yes.
And to piggyback on what Kylee was saying, people have a natural tendency to want to explain phenomenon.
Yes.
And out of ignorance, lack of information, they may say some of those things. So it may not necessarily be mean-spirited, but it's just human nature to want to explain what happened. If people understood that suicide is a problem-solving behavior for a temporary problem, and unfortunately, suicide is permanent. That puts a whole new spin on things. If people understood that people who are contemplating suicide have a tunnel vision where they don't see any other option, if they were to look at it from a life preservation perspective, you are going against human nature by taking your own life. That's not easy to do. So when someone says, "Oh, they took the easy way out," they're not recognizing that they may have tried other problem-solving behaviors. They may have reached out to others, and unfortunately, the others didn't hear what they were saying because it might have been too vague. And the fact that somebody is going against human nature to take their own life, that is probably, in my opinion, one of the hardest things to do.
Sure.
I would agree 100% with that.
Yeah, my answer, and here again, I'm not an expert. A number of years ago, there was a young lady that I knew who died by suicide, and I heard those remarks. And it's very easy to, maybe out of fear, dismiss the fact that you could be in that situation. As you talked about that 10-minute window, we've all had a crisis at one time or another. We've gotten a phone call about an accident in our family, or something horrible has happened, and maybe we say things or we break something. In that moment, in that window, you're not yourself, and we just have to have some empathy for people who have gone down that road.
Very much so.
Yes. Okay. My understanding is that we use the phrase "died by suicide" as opposed to "commit suicide," because the word "commit" is often associated with some sort of a crime. I committed grand larceny. I committed a felony, and so on. Is that something that you two would like to have some input on?
Very much so. The Center for Disease Control, in collaboration with the World Health Organization, is working on some uniform definitions of suicide so that researchers, clinicians, the general public all use the same language. And certain phrases like committing suicide, it emphasizes the end result.
Yes.
And like you said, even the word choice, like committed suicide, has that legal connotation, which unfortunately there are some legal complications if someone dies by suicide.
Yeah, sure.
Insurance policies are not paid out to the bereaved. So being mindful of what you say and how you say it, and how some of those ripple effects can contribute to someone's thoughts, can contribute to the negativity, can contribute to the stigma.
Yes. Kylee, do you have any input on that you would like to share?
I think he did a great job explaining why, because that's the truth. That language leads to the assumption, too, that someone is completing something, or this is a goal we're striving for, when in reality, this is just a devastating tragedy. And using the word "died by suicide" is the best way to address that tragedy.
Very good. Kylee, I'll kind of stay with you on this. We talked about the National Suicide Prevention number, and we can certainly give that number again. How can people reach out for help? What resources are available?
There's a lot of great resources available. I'll start with us, obviously, at CommQuest Services here. We have a variety of services to help people. You can call 330-455-0374. You already discussed the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which again is 800-273-8255. 8255. There's the crisis text line. You can either text home or hello to 741-741. We have our mobile crisis services in Coleman CSU, and you can reach that at 330-452-6000, which is a 24/7 hotline. There's the Veterans Crisis Line, which is 800-273-8255, and then you press 1. And also the Trevor Project, which is 1-866-488-7386.
What exactly is the Trevor Project? I hear that mentioned quite often.
So the Trevor Project is a national hotline, this specific number for the LGBTQ plus community and for people that identify as trans, non-binary, anyone that falls into that community. This is a support hotline for that community.
Oh, that's fantastic. I did not know that. I'm so glad I asked for that. Do you have any? Obviously, Kylie's answer was very extensive. Do you have any suggestions maybe about how to reach out with someone you know? Can you, a friend or family, is that something that is an option?
Most definitely. There's hopefully somebody always available. If it's not someone that you know personally, that's where the hotlines come in. And for those listeners who are outside of Stark County, by calling the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, it will link them to the local 24/7 crisis center in their area.
Oh, okay.
So, Kylie referenced, the crisis center here that's run by Coleman. That's one of multiple 24/7 hotline services available throughout the nation. Great information. As I said at the top of the program, we often end with a message of hope. And here at CommQuest, our slogan, I guess, for lack of a better term, is "Hope happens here." I'll start with Greg. What message of hope for the future? We've had suicide as a major problem in Stark County over the past couple of years. What message of hope would you have for the community and people listening to this program? That there's always help available. Mm-hmm. Whether it's a friend, a loved one, or a professional. Mm-hmm. There's always someone available 24/7. Reach out. We are here for you. We will help you. Mm-hmm. Suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And whatever the problem or problems you are experiencing, somebody can help.
Yes, that's well said, and I love that phrase. A permanent solution to a temporary problem. Kylie.
I would just say you are not alone. And to piggyback off Greg, there is help. There is hope. Educate yourselves, especially if you want to help others, and just be kind.
Be kind. Boy, I'll tell you, it's in our society today, which the division, the political wrangling, the bubbles that everyone is in, and the hostility that's out there. That's a personal thing of mine. You're hassling a young clerk in a store, and no matter what your feelings is about masks or vaccines and these other things, that person that's all they get all day long, and it would be just do the opposite, be extra nice to them, offer them a can of pop, their pop machine's right there. Can I get you something to drink? That can make the biggest difference in someone's life. I did mention the COVID in regard to the masks and the vaccines, and we're not going to get into the politics of that and how that became a political issue. I'll never know, but there's so much wrangling out there. Not only is the disease causing stress, but certainly the politics, the hostility is raising the stress level for a lot of people. Greg, do you have any comment about that? Obviously, in my opinion, in lay terms, I can't imagine any stressor of that type helping anyone who is struggling with any mental health issue.
It's funny you mentioned that, Bill. I did a little research and found an article that was published roughly in June 2020. So it was fairly early on in the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And at that point in time, the thought was the added stressors of life, the isolation, the uncertainty of what's going on, the economic problems were going to negatively impact people who are vulnerable, people with mental illness, people with addictions, people who struggle with resiliency, or maybe someone who has been impacted by COVID. And at that time, the thought was suicide rates are going to go up. Mm-hmm. There was a recent article published by the Journal of the American Medical Association back in July. Mm-hmm. What they actually have found is that suicide rates have actually gone down slightly. Wow. So this particular study had some limitations in terms of how they were gathering data, in terms of death certificates. And we've all heard in the news how some coroners are not recognizing a death by COVID. They're calling it by something else. So those factors could play into, and that's what the authors say. But when you start looking at some of the data, it's kind of mixed. There's this anticipatory, things are going to get worse. But then some data says, no, it's not really playing out that way. So I think it's still to be determined. Nonetheless, if we take into account that some of the risk factors, increased isolation, depression, anxiety, and stress all contribute to the potential for someone to start thinking about suicide, this goes back to that message of hope. Yeah. We need to take care of each other. We need to look out for each other. Reach out to those individuals that you know are vulnerable. Maintain contact. Touch base with someone. Just check in and say, hi, I'm concerned. I care about you. What's going on?
Yes. I would say I was at a restaurant here about a week or two ago, and there was a young woman in line who started to have an anxiety attack. And it was crowded in the lobby area there for a few seconds until they got the tables going. And it just was a reminder that a lot of people are not used to being close to other people. Mm-hmm. And rather than be dismissive when somebody has a moment like that, be supportive. It can make all the difference in the world. Our guests, again, have been Dr. Greg Emanuelson and Kylee Crislip. For our organization, which is CommQuest Services Incorporated. You can find more information about us at CommQuest.org. We have any number of social outreach programs. We have a really good school-based mental health program. We are known, of course, for our treating addiction, but we are also very strong in mental health and other types of recovery. And CommQuest.org would be a good place to start for general information. Of course, you can call us. On the subject of suicide, I am going to, again, leave you with the National Suicide Prevention number, which is 800-273-8255 or TALK, 273-TALK. Thank you both very much for being on this program. It was a great information program, and I really thank you very much for taking time out of you guys do important work, and it means the world for you both to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you for addressing this topic.
Yes.
You're very welcome. My name is Bill, and this has been the Hope Discovered podcast by CommQuest, and thank you very much for listening.